The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant cry of a coyote and the soft whisper of wind through the tall prairie grass. The stars stretched wide and endless above, cold and watchful. Thomas Hale tightened the strap of his rifle across his shoulder as he stepped out of his cabin. He had lived on the frontier long enough to know that silence was never truly empty, yet it was full of dangers waiting in the dark. He had gone to fetch more wood for the fire when he saw her. At first, he thought the shape moving along the edge of the trees was an animal, a thin, stumbling, half hidden by shadows. But as his eyes adjusted, the figure resolved into something human. A girl. She was barefoot, her steps unsteady, her dress torn at the hem. Her long black braids swung loose, streaked with dust and leaves. When she saw him, she froze like a deer caught between flight and collapse. Thomas raised his lantern higher, the light spilling across her face. She couldn't have been more than 15. Her eyes dark, wide, unblinking, were full of defiance even as her knees threatened to give way beneath her. He noticed the small cuts on her arms, the faint smears of dried blood, the way she kept her chin tilted upward, as if daring him to strike first. His first thought was that she was Comanche. His second thought was that if she was here, alone, then trouble wasn't far behind. Every settler in these parts knew the stories: Comanche raids, burned cabins, families vanished without a trace. He should have sent her away. He should have walked back inside, barred the door, and forgotten he ever saw her. But he didn't. The girl swayed on her feet, exhaustion pulling her down despite her will. Without thinking, Thomas stepped forward and caught her by the arm before she could fall. She tried to jerk away, her lips pressing into a thin, proud line, but she had no strength left. "You're safe," he said quietly, though the words felt clumsy on his tongue. He wasn't sure if she understood English, but something in his tone must have reached her. Her shoulders sagged. He led her to the cabin, half expecting her to resist, to bolt into the night like a wild animal. But she didn't. She let herself be guided, too tired to fight, her steps dragging across the dirt. Inside, the fire still burned low in the hearth, filling the single-room cabin with warmth and a faint smell of pine. He settled her on the chair by the table, then set about pouring water into a tin cup. She watched him like a hawk, eyes flicking from his hands to his face, every muscle taut, ready to spring if he turned hostile. He placed the cup in front of her and stepped back. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted it, sniffed, then drank in small, guarded sips. When the water was gone, he gave her bread and dried venison. She ate with the same cautiousness, as though expecting the food to vanish before her eyes. But she did not waste a crumb. Only when she had eaten did Thomas see the tremble in her hands ease slightly. He noticed how small she looked against the rough-hewn chair, her back too straight for comfort, her pride keeping her from slumping into rest. He wanted to ask questions of where she came from, why she was alone, what had happened to her, but he knew better. If she was Comanche, words might mean little, and even if she understood, trust would not come with a handful of food and water. Instead, he brought her a note quilt from his bed and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at first, then stilled. The fabric swallowed her, soft against her thin frame. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy now that her stomach was full and her body warm. "You can sleep," he murmured. She did not reply. She didn't need to. Within minutes, her head tipped to the side, resting against the chair. Her breathing deepened, steady and fragile, like the sound of a bird roosting after a storm. Thomas stood for a long time by the hearth, watching the fire crackle low. He told himself he had done what any man should have: offered shelter to someone in need, no matter who she was. But beneath that justification was unease. He knew the risks. Comanche land stretched across these plains, and though he had carved his cabin out of their hunting grounds, he lived each day on a fragile thread of peace. If her people found her here, what would they believe? That he had stolen her? Taken her prisoner? He clenched his jaw. Out here, misunderstandings often ended in blood. Still, he couldn't regret it. Not when he thought of her eyes in the lantern light, full of fire even when her body had nearly given way. He had seen enough suffering in these lines of families to burn apart, children lost. If it cost him something to let one child sleep safe for a night, then so be it. The hours stretched on. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant howl of wolves. The prairie grass rustled like whispers just beyond the walls. But inside the cabin, It was quiet. The girl slept, curled beneath the quilt, the faint glow of embers painting her face in shades of gold and shadow. Thomas lay awake on his bed, rifle resting close at hand. He could not silence the voice in his mind that told him dawn would bring consequences, that nothing on this frontier came without a price. And yet, when he drifted at last unto uneasy sleep, it was not fear that filled his thoughts, but the image of a child's proud face softening into rest, safe beneath his roof. He had no way of knowing that, by morning, the ground around his home would shake with the thunder of 70 horses. The first light of dawn broke across the prairie, washing the horizon in pale gold. Thomas stirred from uneasy sleep, his hand instinctively resting on the rifle by his bed. For a fleeting moment, he thought the night had passed in silence, that perhaps the girl could slip away before anyone came looking for her. But then he felt it, a tremor beneath the floorboards, a distant thunder that wasn't thunder at all. Horses, many horses. He threw on his boots and stepped outside. The chill of morning air bit at his skin, but it wasn't the cold that tightened his chest. His cabin was no longer alone on the wide plain. Encircling it, stretching in every direction, were warriors. Comanche. There must have been 70 of them, mounted on restless, snorting ponies. Feathers, paint, and leather caught the rising sun, turning them into living flames of war. Spears and rifles gleamed. They were silent, but their silence was heavier than any battle cry. At their head rode a man whose presence was unmistakable, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a decorated buffalo robe, his face painted in fierce red streaks. He carried himself with the authority of one who commanded not just men, but fear itself. His eyes, sharp as obsidian, fixed on Thomas with a fire that left no doubt. This was the girl's father. Thomas's stomach turned. He had heard tales of this Chva man known for his ruthlessness, his skill, his refusal to bend to any encroaching settler, and now, he was here for his daughter. Behind Thomas, the cabin door creaked. He glanced back. The girl had woken, standing barefoot in the doorway, quilt still around her shoulders. Her eyes widened as she saw the circle of warriors. For a heartbeat, fear flickered across her face. But when her gaze landed on the man at their head, her expression shifted. Recognition. Blood called to blood. The chief raised his spear, his voice carrying like thunder over the still prairie. "You took my daughter." The words were English, broken, but clear. The warriors stirred, shifting in their saddles, murmurs rippling through the line. Thomas swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his heart hammering. He wanted to raise his rifle, to shout that he meant no harm. But 70 warriors against one man and a cabina. It wasn't a fight, it was a death sentence. He steadied his voice. "I found her alone. I gave her food, shelter, that is all." The chief's gaze darkened, suspicion radiating from every line of his body. He barked something in Comanche, and the warriors growled their agreement, horses stamping the ground. The air grew heavier, as though the earth itself held its breath. Thomas felt the girl's hand on his sleeve, light, trembling, but insistent. He looked down, her lips parted, and for the first time since she had entered his cabin, she spoke, not in English, but in her own tongue. A stream of words that tumbled toward her father. Her voice wavered, but carried the urgency of the truth. The chief's eyes narrowed, his grip tightened on the spear. He barked back at her, sharp and commanding. She answered, louder this time, her chin lifted the way it had been the night before, full of defiance. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could see the shift. The anger in her father's expression was no longer simple ragia, it was tangled with confusion, with something almost like doubt. Finally, the girl stepped forward, leaving Thomas's side. The quilt slipped from her shoulders, cooling at her feet. She stood barefoot in the dirt, facing the circle of warriors with nothing but her small frame and fierce eyes. Her hands moved as she spoke again, gesturing to Thomas, then back to herself. The silence that followed was suffocating. The chief studied her for a long moment. His gaze slid back to Thomas. The spear lowered, only slightly, but enough for the warriors to notice. A ripple moved through the circle. He dismounted slowly, each movement deliberate, the buffalo robe shifting as he landed with a weight of authority. Dust rose around his boots. He strode forward until he stood only a few yards from Thomas. Up close, his presence was overwhelming. The air thick with danger. "You give food," he said at last, his English halting but heavy with meaning. "You give me a broken bar shelter." He jabbed a finger toward the cabin. Then his eyes sharpened. "But why?" Thomas forced himself not to step back. "Because she was alone. Because she was a child. No more reason than that." The chief's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze back to the girl. She stared at him, unblinking, her small body rigid with the force of her will. Something softened in his expression barely. A crack in the mask of the warrior. He reached out, laid a hand briefly on her shoulder. She did not flinch. He spoke again, this time in Comanche, his voice lower, calmer. The girl nodded. Slowly, she stepped back to his side. Thomas exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The chief turned back to him. "You not our friend," he said, the words hard as stone. "But you not enemy. A broken bar today." The warning was clear. This was no alliance, no gesture of peace. It was a single reprieve, granted only because of what Thomas had done the night before. He lifted his spear high, signaling to the warriors. As one, they pulled back, horses wheeling, the circle breaking apart. The thunder of hooves filled the prairie once more, rolling away into the distance until only silence remained. Thomas stood frozen on the threshold of his cabin, heart still pounding. The girl was gone with her father, the quilt abandoned in the dust. For a moment, the prairie seemed too wide, too empty. He bent, picked up the quilt, and shook off the dirt. The fabric was warm from where she had worn it. He folded it carefully, set it on the chair where she had slept. The house felt hollow now, but not with regret, only with the heavy weight of understanding. He had given shelter for a single night, and in return, he had brushed against the thin line between life and death, war and peace. And he on the frontier, a single act of mercy could be the most dangerous choice of all.